All right, so in this module, we're going to go over how to do impulse excitation, or resonance testing for short. We want to do this on our 4140 steel for this 4140 steel lab to get the elastic properties. So that can be the elastic modulus, shear modulus, Poisson's ratio. And all of these are done with this technique, impulse excitation, in a non-destructive manner. So we're able to use the sample again and again because we're not destroying it, like a tensile test. So that's what we're going to do, and that's what we want to get out of this test. So now let's talk about the materials and equipment that we need. So the first thing that you need is this resonance sample. We'll come back to this in a second, but this is just a straight rectangular bar of the 4140 steel. We're going to cut that down, but I'll talk about that in a second. We also need something to cause the excitation, and so that is just this little, what they call impulse hammer. And so it's just, all it is just a ball bearing attached to a flexible piece of plastic. So this is going to be our little hammer. So we've got that. Also, for our setup for collecting data, we have a microphone here. It's a very small microphone, and it has a very wide range of being able to detect frequencies. So this is a very high-powered microphone, but it's very small. And it's connected back here to a National Instruments data acquisition setup that goes to our LabVIEW program. And this LabVIEW program is what takes the raw data and converts it into frequency for us. So that's what we're going to need. We're going to need the software, the LabVIEW data acquisition stuff, the microscope, our sample, and on top of that, to be able to hear the frequency and the vibration, we need supports. And so we have, you might be able to see it here, foam support that we're going to cut to size and length, and it's just on a sort of a measuring board here, something that we can stick to it. So to get those, you might need some double-sided tape. All right, so let me just quickly go over the steps that we're going to do to get impulse excitation data. So the first thing that we're going to discuss is cutting it to length. Once we've cut it to length, we want to determine the dimensions and the mass. And after that, we're going to set up our support system for the various flexure modes. After that, I'm going to discuss how we actually perform the impulse excitation test using the hammer and our data acquisition system to calculate the frequency. And then those frequencies will be used along with the dimensions and mass to calculate along with the frequencies as well, to calculate the elastic modulus, shear modulus, and Poisson's ratio. So that's kind of the summary of what we're going to do, and so we'll kind of go through those points one by one, and how you get everything from impulse excitation. Okay, so let's go over the first step. So cutting the sample. So you'll get a bar like this at the start of the lab. It will go through various heat treatments, and then after the heat treatments are done and we want to start testing, this bar is not only used for this resonance test, but it is also used for metallography. And so the pieces that are used for metallography are bits from the end. So basically we cut off a small amount from each end to have two samples for metallography, and the rest is used for this resonance test. So you can look at the cutoff video cutoff saw video that's shown in order to determine how to use that. But the only other requirement is, according to the ASTM that we're using for this impulse excitation lab, the certain constants that we use are dependent on the size. And so to use those constants, we need to have a length to thickness ratio of 20 or greater. So before you cut, you'll want to make sure that you measure the thickness and the length, and make sure that you're not going to cut off too much to get under that 20 length to thickness ratio. We want to be above it, and I suggest trying to be pretty far above it, so maybe 25. So before you cut off the metallography samples, make sure that it's at least 20 times the length of the thickness. So once you have that cut, the next step is we're going to set up the support system for the different modes that we're going to be testing. So I'll get set up again so you can see this better, and we'll look at how we set the supports for this test. All right, so I'm assuming that you've already cut the sample to your desired size, and the next step was to take the dimensions and mass. So again, I'm going to assume that you've already taken the dimensions, so you need the length, the thickness, and then the width, as well as the mass. So all of those need to be obtained and written in your lab notebook. And so now what we need to do is we need to set up the supports. I already have some supports here, but we have a lot of foam material around the lab in order to do this. So just to kind of get where this information is coming from, we're going to use ASTM, and I have it here, it might be hard to see, but this is ASTM C1259, and this talks about the impulse excitation technique, and it shows you the different modes. So we're going to set up two types of support. One of them is known as flexure. That's what's shown here. So this is flexure. And then the other one is called torsion here. And this is in the handout for this activity as well. And if we want to kind of see what that looks like, you can imagine flexure just like the 4-point bend that we did in the previous lab. So we put two supports on the bottom, and we basically look at it going like this. So that's flexure. And so we need to set up supports on 2 points of the bar. For torsion, this is best thought of as basically like trying to twist the bar. And so to isolate that type of frequency, we actually need to have a support on the bottom running the length of the bar and then across in a cross fashion. So something like this. So those are the two types of support. So the two bars like this with a sample across, that is flexure. And again, this configuration here with the supports where they are is meant to isolate that type of frequency. And then the cross, like we have over here, is meant to isolate the torsion frequency. And so that's what we're going to do. So to do this, we need to know the length of the bar because the supports depend on the length. And what our handout here says from the ASTM and our handout as well is, and again, you can't see that, but we need to measure the length and go 0.224 times the length away from the end. And so I actually have this already marked out right. So it's 0.224 times the length, and you basically make a mark, and you do it on the other side as well. So that is where the supports are going to be. And so I set those points up, and those two nodal lines, flexure nodal lines caused by the supports, are 0.224 times the length away from the end. So we have this already set up to this length. But if we didn't, we could cut out pieces of foam and adhere them to this board with some double-sided tape to get them at the right length. So we have the support set up for flexure. For torsion, like I said, we need a cross. And so we need one strip down the middle and then one through the middle of that, forming a cross. And for that, it's helpful to mark the middle of the bar because that's where we want the cross to be, and we want it to line up nicely. So you want this line through the center of the bar, and this line through the other center of the bar. So those are the 2 points. And so this is now set up for torsion. The supports are all set up. All right, so here in a second then, we'll go through how the test and how the frequency is actually captured once we have the supports ready and we have our sample on the supports. All right, so let's talk about the positioning of everything for the flexure. So we're going to go off this diagram. So if you can't see it, maybe pull up the handout. But these are the 2 nodal positions, and then we also have reference to where to strike the sample and where the microphone should go. So we're going to set it up with the spacing of the nodal lines, the supports, where we discussed in the last part. So it's set up like that. And the point down here says M1, so that is the microphone. So basically we want to position the microphone at the very end of the bar. And so I'm going to position it right over the end of the bar. And I can also lower this so that it's as close to the top of the bar as possible. But you want to be careful because this microphone is expensive. So be careful when you move the microphone. So it's very close to the bar itself, and it's right on the end of the bar. So basically that's this point here. These are the supports, and then this point right in the middle says X1. That is where we strike the sample for impulse excitation. So that causes the impulse. So I'm going to use my hammer and hit right there. And so you might have heard that noise. That's that's what we're going for. We should isolate more or less a single frequency, and so this should be the flexure frequency of this bar. And so that gives us information about the elastic modulus based on the dimensions and the mass. So I hit the sample right in the middle. I have the microphone at the end, right in the center of the bar, and that's the setup for flexure. So let's now go over and switch this to torsion. So like I said before, with torsion, we're going to use this cross that you can see here. So I'm going to set it up again so that everything is centered. So the cross goes right through the middle and down the center. So feel free to mark this with a permanent marker so you can indicate those positions. And for this mode, again, the diagram here, which you might have trouble seeing, but you can look at it in the handout. It also tells us where we are going to strike the sample with the hammer and where we're going to place the microphone. So here, this is called M3, and this is right where the flexure line was. So right to, we have the mark still. You can see the mark right there. That's the flexure mark. We're basically going to strike with the hammer. Or sorry, this is the microphone. Sorry. We're going to place the microphone right near that nodal point, right toward on the other side of the nodal line, towards the end here. And so I'm going to do it up here though. So I'm just going to flip everything in that diagram. And so let me go ahead and reposition this. And I'm going to place the microphone right to the right of that nodal position on the back side. So I should mention this is the nodal line in flexure. So we don't actually have support like we did there in the previous. So that's just a quick note. All right, so it's right above the bar, to the right, and then to back corner, mimicking this position here for M3. So then X3 over here near the other flexure nodal line on the opposite half is going to be where I hit. So basically right on that nodal line that you can see on this side, and that's opposite of where the microphone is. So I'm going to hit it over here. And so if I just hit it a couple times, you might be able to hear that frequency, and you know, trust your ears on this too. That frequency sounds different. To me, that sounds like a higher pitch. And that's because we're isolating another frequency. In this case, the torsion frequency. And this is used to calculate the shear modulus. So this will give us information in torsion, which can be used to calculate the shear modulus. The flexure, which was over here, that's going to be used to calculate the elastic modulus. And then those two quantities will be used together to give us Poisson's ratio if we have an isotropic material. So these are the positions for both of the setups. And so then we're done with that. So now I'm going to walk you through our software and how it collects frequency data. All right, so now we're looking at the computer hooked up to the Resonance software. And so if I'm on the desktop, I'm going to find the file here, the program. It's called CME Materials Frequency V1, so version 1. And so this is the program, and so you just want to double click to open it. And once you do, you'll have this, something that looks like this window pop up. So this is the home screen. This is really the only screen that you'll see for the frequency software. So what we have, and I'll kind of walk you through frame by frame here. This first one is called the waveform data. So this is basically the raw data. It has amplitude here on the y-axis and time on the x-axis. And then we have another frame for it up here and here. So all of these are basically waveform data. And what our program does, what this LabVIEW program does, is it converts the waveform using a fast Fourier transformation into amplitude versus frequency. And so we'll get peaks where we have specific frequencies occur. And so if we're good in our setup, then we're trying to isolate one frequency, so the flexure or the torsion. And so that will populate here as a peak, and then we'll be able to read off the frequency. And we have it set up, so this is an amplitude versus frequency, so is this, this, and this. So we have 6. What's going to happen, and I'll just click it and it'll start to acquire data, but if I go down here and click acquire spectrum, it's going to start the program, and you see that this first one lit up, and then the next one. And so when it's lit up, it's collecting data for that window. So we're able to run 6 different experiments on the same screen. And so whenever it's lit up, it's going to collect data on this screen, and then this one, and then this one, and you can see the raw data populate up here. So right now we just see some noise at the low end, and so this can be from the furnaces in the room, my voice, all of that, and so that's why you see some information here. This tends to go down when we have the microphone set up in the proper position, and it's picking up the frequency of the metal vibrating, and so that will be there. So let's go ahead and do that. You're going to hear me hitting the sample. This is in flexure mode, so I'm hitting it right in the center of the sample. So I'm going to go ahead and hit acquire, and I'm going to stop talking, but I'm going to hit the sample like this, if you could hear that. And I'm going to hit it once in each box. So when it lights up here, I'll hit the sample. When it lights up here, I'll hit it again and again and again. And so I'll get 6 data points for this. So let me go ahead and do this. All right, so now you can see a little bit more happened, right? So this is the amplitude versus time, and you see the raw data up here. The amplitude is very high initially, and then it tapers off, right? We hit the sample, and then you hear less and less of it. And then there's different time steps, and then here you can kind of see that this is the amplitude, and we can measure the frequency from time versus amplitude. And that's what we see down here, is a collection of the frequencies that we see. And so what you see in all of these is that there's one predominant peak here, a little past this marking, which is about 2,500 hertz. All of these units are hertz. And you see that that signal is the same in all of them. So once we have data, all of it is summarized in this final window that we see over here. And so this sums up, it might be hard to see it, but it sums up all of the data. You might also notice that there's another peak, but it's at a much lower intensity. So this could be another frequency from the steel that we're picking up, because we're not perfectly isolating the flexure frequency. So it's common to get other frequencies, but we're looking for the predominant one in flexure. So that's, we're going to assume that that's this one because the amplitude is so much higher. So now we want to get the frequency, and we're not just going to eyeball it. We're going to use the graph here to help us. And so one thing we can do, so on this summary file, what we can do is we can click on the axis and readjust the x-axis by typing in information. So you might have seen that just move. So I put 2,500 over here, and then I'm going to try 3,000 over on the other side. So you see that I've kind of centered it up. So let me do that a couple more times. And all I'm trying to do is focus on the one peak. All right, so here you can see it pretty well. I went from 2750 to 2850, and you can see the main peak here, and you might be able to see the different colors indicating the different, all the different 6 samples that we're looking at. And they might have different amplitudes. The amplitude is not important, but it should be a relatively large amplitude relative to the background that you can kind of see here. So I've isolated that, and now I'm going to use the software to calculate the frequency for us from this. So what it's going to do is it's going to find the maximum for each peak. So we're going to assume that the maximum is the center of the peak. So we're assuming it's a nice centered peak, Gaussian peak. And so all I have to do is click on this, which says, if you can't read it, it says find windowed maximum. And if I click this, you'll see that it populates amplitudes here and the frequency here. And again, you might not be able to read that. That is 2797.06, and each one of the 6 boxes says that same number. So we were able to obtain the same frequency 6 times. So again, 2796.06 hertz. So that is the frequency that I need. That is the flexural frequency that I'm going to use along with the dimensions and the mass to calculate the elastic modulus. So that's the procedure that we're going to do to determine the elastic modulus. So we'll get set up here again, and we'll go and look at the torsional data for that same sample. All right, so now I've repositioned the bar into the torsion mode on the cross supports. So if I hit it in that configuration in the proper position, you'll hear that different tone. So let's go ahead and now rerun the experiment using our LabVIEW software to determine the frequency. So again, I'll hit acquire, and I'll hit the sample each time the windowed box becomes lit up. So I'll do that, and I won't talk over it. All right. So I had a little bit more difficulty hitting the sample in that one. And here you notice, again, we have a predominant peak for the most part, but here a second peak appears quite frequently. And so this one actually is a little trickier to hit. And so I think that's I'm hitting in the wrong position, which is why we're getting this. So if we look at the summarized data, the majority peak is this second one. That's the highest one that we're observing. And then we have this minor peak. So if I ran it again, I think we would more or less hit that. So once I got better, after the first two, you'll notice I started hitting it more consistently. And so that's the second peak here on the last four. So again, you can get additional frequencies if you hit in the wrong place or if the supports aren't set up properly. So we're gonna always default to the highest peak, but if we're in doubt, we can always collect the frequencies of the minor peak in case something doesn't add up later. So let's assume that it's the second peak and go through the same process. So it's close to 10,000 hertz. And so I'm gonna try 9,000 here on the left side. All right, that looks pretty good. And then let's try 9,500. Okay, that's pretty good. And then just a little fine tune there. So I'm just adjusting the axes here. And so I'm going from 9,200 to 9,350 hertz in order to isolate that predominant peak that we saw. So again, you see that they tend to match up pretty well. You see that the last two here on the bottom don't have a very high frequency, so there could be issues with those. So you can always redo the test. It's very quick, and so if you feel like you're missing the target, you might try it again and see if you can get rid of these lower peaks. But we're going to do the same thing. Now that we have it isolated, we're going to hit find windowed maximum, and it's going to populate the amplitudes and the frequencies. And for the most part, the frequencies are similar, but a couple of them are different. So 9287.17, the same number, 9286.66, that same number, and then back to the first number, and then back to the second. So I would imagine that these smaller ones may show some slight deviation because they're too small and they're not centered. But we would write those numbers down, and we can use those to calculate the shear modulus using the calculations in the handout and in the ASTM. So this, along with the dimensions and mass, you'll use to calculate the shear modulus. And once you've calculated both the elastic and the shear modulus, that will allow you to calculate Poisson's ratio from the two. So this software is pretty straightforward in how we use it. And it gives us the frequency, and this is the number that we're going to write down. So when you look at the data in the data files, this frequency is what you'll see written for the data. And since it was collected by others in years past, some of that data may talk about an additional peak. And so if we go back and plot the whole thing, that could be the secondary peak too. So they might have just recorded the value of the secondary peak in case that happened to be important. So this is how we collect the data for impact excitation using our kind of house-made LabVIEW software and our house-made lab equipment in order to get the frequencies for calculating elastic modulus and shear modulus along with Poisson's ratio.